Art education teaches people, and like not just kids but people in general, to think outside of what you know.
So being creative, being able to adapt, being able to collaborate is something that can happen in all classrooms, but it always inherently happens in the art classroom.
Creativity, exploring art, exploring music, exploring theater, these creative outlets. At least for me, it was a way to find myself and to find my voice.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to DesignTV by SANDOW on Earth Day. I hope you have a great day today thinking about the impact that we have on this planet, the relationship that we share with all living and non-living entities on this planet. Earth Day is a great reminder every year of the impact of human activity, the footprint of human activity on the systems on this planet of which we are a part. And it's a day of reflection. And I'm so thrilled to have a fantastic group of people to reflect with me today on the opportunities that we have in the building sector, whether you're an architect or interior designer, whether you're a developer or a contractor or an engineer, all the different roles that we have in this building sector, the things that we can do in the fight against the climate crisis, which is, of course, the large looming challenge ahead of all of us, as well as what we can do to create a more sustainable and more harmonious relationship between all living beings and all processes on this planet. So happy Earth Day, everyone. With me today are Professor Vivian Loftness, who is a professor and Paul Mellon Chair of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Vivian, such a pleasure to have you with us today. Also with us is Drew Shula, who is the founder and principal of Vertical Group and a creator of the Net Zero Conference. Drew, such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. And we also have Elizabeth Thompson, who is a vice president at USGBC, the US Green Buildings Council. Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today.
Thank you for having me. Happy Earth Day.
So everyone, I'd love for us to start to just get a sense of where you're at. We're on this Earth Day, we're about 9 years to our 2030 deadline. The IPCC, of course, at the start of this year, again, reminded us, that this year has to be a year of action. So tell us, what is top of mind for you where sustainability is concerned? Vivian, maybe you want to start us off here.
Thank you, Avinash. I think, and happy Earth Day to all of you. I have had the privilege of serving on a National Academy Committee on decarbonizing the US by 2050 and what we have to do by 2030, which, as you say, is imminent if we're actually going to achieve carbon neutrality as a nation. And the first thing a message to the entire audience of Metropolis is the importance of making it clear how critical the building sector is to the solution set. Because if you actually Google greenhouse gases and look at every pie chart, you'll find that buildings are this little sliver. It's split into residential and commercial, and they've literally stripped the buildings of their electric loads. And they've given them to an electricity sector as if that's an end-use sector. So as a consequence, public policy often diminishes the importance of the built environment to the answer. And yet we are absolutely a third to somewhere between 35 and 40% of the answer. So the first thing we need to do is get all those pie charts taken down and replaced by ones where the building sector is clearly indicated, including, of course, the embodied carbon that's in the materials. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how much of the solution we have already in our hands as professionals. The first would be the 2030 challenge, and the number of firms that have signed on to the 2030 commitment is rising rapidly. I think there are well over 700 firms, large and small, and they're literally ensuring that their entire portfolio, both new and retrofit, is achieving, is driving towards carbon neutrality. And at this point, many of them are 70% below where they were when they started their commitment, which is huge. And we have to get to a 50 quad reduction in carbon by 2050 as a standing load for a nation at large. And the building sector, through efficient new building design, could give 5 or 6 of those quads just through this 2030 commitment. Then for those who are interior designers in this room, the importance of what we pick and select to put inside buildings, all of those electric plug loads are huge. It's another 5 or 6 quads of plug load. And often that is growing as a bigger phenomena as we start to get more and more efficient buildings. Then finally, urban planning and infrastructure, the entire transportation sector, which is a significant sector in the carbon footprint, is obviously compromised by our inability to walk places or bike places or even take transit, right? So ultimately, if we can get ourselves engaged in a transit-oriented development, in building buildings in places where people can walk, building communities where people can live, work, and walk, we can have such a positive impact on reducing the loads in the transportation sector. I think that's enough good ideas from my side. I'll pass the baton to the next.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And that's a really important reminder. We often see the building sector, as you said, represented as a pretty small sliver of the solutions or of the people who have influence on carbon emissions worldwide, but actually, our influence is huge. So thank you so much, Vivian, for laying that out. Drew, what are your thoughts on Earth Day?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Avi, and to be here with Vivian and Elizabeth, luminaries in our field. So really excited to be speaking with you all today. I think a couple of things that stand out to me, and I'm a startup guy, started a small green building company in Los Angeles, Vertical Group. All we do is green building consulting, and then our Net Zero conference as well, which is a big conference about all the stuff that we're talking about today. One big thing for me is just simplifying the message. We use a lot of terminology that's complicated, and we just need to simplify things as much as we can and stick to the most important data points. I think Vivian mentioned one of the most important for me is that the AEC industry is 40% of the problem, but that's also inspiring to me because that's such a huge positive impact that we can make as an industry. So simplifying the message, I think, is really important. Just to focus on what we're doing, get everybody on the same page. And that, carbon is the buzzword. It's the big thing to focus on. Operational carbon, embodied carbon, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of those discussions today as we talk about the really massive impact designers can have on the carbon footprint of the whole planet.
Right. Elizabeth, your thoughts on Earth Day?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed how you said towards the beginning of the discussion that what we're doing here is appreciating our relationships with all beings on the planet. And I think that kind of sets the tone for where we are at this particular Earth Day, where we're towards the end of the pandemic. And we've also been challenged in all sorts of ways to increase our understanding of equity and social justice. I love Drew's message of simplifying and taking that broad scope of the construction industry and looking at that as something where we can really make a big difference. And I think that we also bring a lot of really particular expertise. Certainly within the USGBC, we're so lucky to have been able to harness the expertise of all of our amazing volunteers, experts throughout the world, of which Drew and Vivian are 2 of the wonderful ones. And being able to bring all of that expertise, all of those reference standards, and use that toolkit to help substantially transform the way that we think about the built environment. So if a client comes to us and says, I want an X, how can we help that client to use the expertise that we have and reimagine what they want in a way that's more empowering for all people, while meeting our very ambitious and necessary carbon goals.
You know, the thing that I think I take away from both Drew's comments and your comments, Elizabeth, is that, you know, while we're driving towards these goals, you know, there is this kind of a constant reflection and introspection we need to have in terms of, you know, whether we're on track, what we're doing, how we're doing it, what the impacts of it are. But also there's such a huge creative opportunity, you know, and even in the three things, Vivian, that you listed out, right? There's just so much opportunity for us in terms of the things we can be doing to lower carbon emissions. Absolutely, that's our #1 goal with the climate crisis. But as we're looking at carbon, as you said, Elizabeth, we're looking at some of those other factors as well. And you know, and the one thing we all, if there's one lesson for Earth Day, it's that everything is connected, right? I mean, that is fundamentally the message of Earth Day, you know, and so that's really important to keep track of. Vivian, are you optimistic? Do you think that, you know, especially on energy and carbon, which are the two big things we're tracking now, do you feel like the building sector, we can meet those goals? I know you've been part of that recent study. You know, is it possible? Are we still in the realm of being able to do something about it?
Well, the time is running quickly. We're late to I am optimistic. I'm optimistic relative to the 2050 goals. I certainly feel that we need to accelerate a lot between now and 2030 across our professions. I think maybe one of the things that is going to be catalytic to this is not just getting sort of a carbon price or making people aware of the carbon footprint, but tying our response to energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction, tying it to quality of life, tying it to equity. I think we've got a challenge in front of us to sort of rephrase the purpose of what we're doing. I mean, we obviously, one of the main purposes is to live, you know, in harmony with all living things on this globe, and realizing that we have a limited amount of resources. But we have an opportunity right now, especially in this administration, to talk about what does the building sector contribute to jobs? What does it contribute to addressing inequity? How does it provide access to better physical environments? People, you know, walkable communities are a real asset. The ability for kids to be able to walk to school or walk to, for families to be able to get healthy groceries. I mean, there's just, if we can begin to turn our dialogue around the outcomes of carbon neutrality and what it does to improve quality of life, I think we have a real chance. And I think we need to find that language together.
Right. Drew, that sounds like a cue for you. You know, at the Net Zero conference, I mean, you know, you're talking to some of the people who are at the forefront for driving for carbon neutrality. And yet, you know, I think, as Vivian is saying, carbon neutrality in and of itself is not just a material goal. It's not just to do with sort of, you know, manufacturing processes of cement and concrete. You know, it has the potential to change the way we live, the way we work, the way we, you know, connect with each other in communities. Specifically, Drew, you talk about climate resilience a lot. Tell us what this idea of resilience is, and how does that feature in your thinking around net zero and zero carbon?
Great question. So I'll stick with my theme of keeping things simple. And so for me, just talking about resiliency, which again is, we use so much terminology in the sustainability world. I just think about it as like thinking about the future, like future proofing, being ready for what's going to happen in the future, thinking ahead. It's that straightforward. And you know, Vivian's mentioning a lot of great points just now. You know, you were asking Avi about, do we have time to pull this off? And we're trying to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming for the planet. A lot of people are working towards 2030. I am really optimistic as well. I'm optimistic by nature, but I do feel optimistic about our ability to get there. I'm in California, and we had a big drought here a few years ago, and I've seen how quickly things changed when the governor, Brown at the time, mandated restrictions around water use for the state, immediately there was a 30% reduction in water use overnight. And so once, we've got everybody on this call right now, we're out there kind of, ringing the alarm bells. Bill McKibben is a huge advocate, right, in our community, and there's many others. But as more and more people get on board, and that is happening, it was one of the primary talking points in our most recent presidential election. We saw the debates with Trump and Biden. One of the big questions was around climate change and climate action. So America as a country, and then globally, the United Nations, we're starting to focus on this. And Vivian mentioned carbon tax. Like, that's something that I think will really make change happen very fast once something like that comes out. So all these things we're talking about at our Net Zero conference, it's very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts with this whole thing, but I am optimistic about our ability to pull it off.
Absolutely. All sustainability practices, in a way, a way of looking at the future, right? As we're building a building today, as we're creating community today, we're trying to project, how is it going to function? How is it going to build relationships with, material flows, with human beings, with, other living things, right? It is an act of imagining the future. And I think there's something inherently optimistic, as you said, Drew, about what we do. Elizabeth, I'd like to bring you in here on sort of, you were speaking about the pandemic, right? And how it has changed our viewpoint. And, one of the, I think, critical perspectives that's emerged that, had been building up for a while before the pandemic, but it seemed like, the global pandemic kind of just, brought it to a boil, which is really looking at health, right? The health of communities, the health of people, the health of buildings, the health of sort of of ecologies. Tell us a little bit about how at the USGBC you've been adopting health as a lens to look at sustainable architecture.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. At the USGBC, we've certainly shifted to incorporate the safety first credits, the credits that give guidelines on how to safely reemerge into our built spaces. And we, of course, also have had this long trajectory of future proofing, as I think Drew said, where we recognize, similar to how many folks did during the pandemic, that a small investment early in a different action than when we would normally take, like wearing a mask, can make a big difference in the future and in the investments that are required to have people be healthy and safe going forward. So we've been really lucky, again, to tap our volunteers and to create those safety first credits. Also, our credits in general, about 2/3 of our credits are indirectly or directly related to health and human safety. And then I think it's about 40% are directly related to human health. So we have always felt that those small investments in using healthier materials, using things that promote better indoor air quality, are a great investment for everyone. And then often, of course, those materials have important ripple effects in terms of our environmental health and safety.
I think Drew and Elizabeth, you both said this right at the beginning. I mean, this Earth Day, I think just because we've all been part of this global event that, has been felt locally in different places around the world, but, it's something that has, really tied us together in a common experience around the world, something we've not had for a while. It feels like this year should be some kind of a watershed moment for, not just health, but the sustainability movement as well. So I'd love to just hear from all of you, any thoughts you have on sort of what has this year meant to you, like what, or this past year, 2020, 21, what has it meant to you in terms of accelerating maybe some parts of your work? Has it given you new priorities or new insights in places? Are you pushing for, advocating for connections maybe that we weren't advocating for quite as stridently, before 2020? So just to get a sense of, how this year has shifted things for you.
I can start with that one. Yeah, great question, Avi. There's a great Bill Gates quote that he came out with last year around, COVID and the pandemic that we've been facing, that I think our global emissions dropped by something like 8%, something like that, which is, a huge deal, right? Like we had this trend of, raising emissions, and then they immediately dropped because the whole global economy shut down. But his quote was great because it was like, it flipped that and said it only dropped by 8% with the massive, global shutdown that we experienced, so much pain, and it only reduced emissions by 8%. So we have a lot of work to do. It was really illustrating that this year with the COVID response. Shout out to USGBC for amazing leadership, Elizabeth, with the COVID response credits. We've been using those on our projects. It's been super cool to have those available to us on the lead projects that we manage. But Avi, you're asking about one of the biggest focal points sort of in response. And to me, again, sort of simplifying, dumbing it down, we need to stop burning fossil fuels, right? Like that's what we need to stop doing. We need to, gas, coal. So getting natural gas out of buildings is a huge focus right now. So you'll hear people talking about electrification, decarbonization. These are all terms around that goal. To the extent that we can get off of gas, we're really reducing our footprint in a big way. It's one of the big focal points that my company's focusing on right now.
I'm gonna jump in with a slightly different set of issues that have certainly always been on the front burner for me and have risen up in this pandemic, which is the importance of embracing nature in design. I think everyone has felt the sort of pent up, cooped up emotions of being in a physical building, at home, and by and large for days and days and months, and getting outside and being able to enjoy any percent of outdoor living and walking and biking has been a hugely regenerative part of everyone's life. But it actually ends up being a huge part of reducing our carbon footprint. And we really haven't given it full tribute. Nature offers us free light for a lot of hours of the day. It offers us free breathing air, free cooling for a lot of days in the year. It offers us free heating in terms of sunshine, and we do not embrace it to the level we should. And yet we've now realized in the pandemic that we have to increase ventilation rates, that we really benefit from having sunshine. Ultraviolet light is a sterilizer. We're beginning to realize that biophilic content, both inside our spaces and being able to spill outdoors into outdoor work, living, teaching spaces, entertainment, everything that we used to do inside of a sealed box, we're finding maybe it'd be better if it weren't quite so sealed. So I hope that we'll walk away from this pandemic with a completely renewed energy about passive conditioning.
Just love that. Focus on biomimicry, biophilia. Thank you, Vivian. That was awesome.
Elizabeth, any further thoughts on sort of the effect of the pandemic on the movement?
Yeah. I think you also mentioned kind of early on that there is this introspection that I think all of us have been kind of invited to. And while it's been amazing to see that like our green building market has actually increased, spending on green buildings has actually gone up during the pandemic. I think that does speak to people noticing both the value for human health and the essential qualities of making a more sustainable world. We've also really, in that time of introspection and being more in our indoor and outdoor spaces together, noticed the radical shift toward racial justice and toward making space for everyone at the table and listening and bringing humility and getting to know the really hard and in some cases horrible stories that go with that, those different experiences. And so I think that that's something that, especially in my volunteer work, I really appreciated the challenge to come there, and then been inspired by the USGBC's leadership on that front too, where there are a lot of areas where we're working really hard toward racial justice, to educate ourselves as individuals, as part of the USGBC, and to collaborate with our communities as we do that better, and getting to see the projects that we have over the years, and certainly the conversations over the past year during the pandemic, where those values are really coming to light in ways that challenge us and inspire us and give us hope for moving forward.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And I'd like to actually dive a little deeper into that question of racial justice, climate justice, and equity in just a few moments. Before we do that, I want to kind of round out the discussion we've had around carbon just a little bit, because I think the two are ultimately, of course, like everything, connected. We spoke about embodied carbon, and and in the context of both architects and interior designers. Just to for anybody listening who is kind of new, Drew, thank you for reminding us a lot that we have our own jargon, right, in sustainable architecture and design. We need precise language for precise concepts, but I think just to say, to simplify it, when you're designing a building, the very often we're calculating as energy, the energy, for instance, it takes to turn the lights on in a building, right? And to keep them on over the life of a building, that's called operational energy or operation. And then the emissions associated with that are operational carbon. But there's also all of that energy that's already been spent to mine the minerals out of the earth, turn them into parts for lighting, make them into lights, ship them to the building site, and then install them, right? And all of that energy that's used up is, of course, embodied energy, and the emissions associated with it are embodied carbon. And while we've all, it's great for building owners and everyone. It's been wonderful for the last 20, 30 years for everybody to really look at, our utility bills are going to be lower, and that's a powerful return on investment for green building, right? That operational energy, I think, we've made big strides in reducing that, even though we have challenges with electrification and so on. From all your points of view, would you mind talking to us a little bit about embodied carbon, that is the carbon that is used, the emissions that we're generating while making all the materials and all of that, and bringing them together and turning them into buildings and interiors? How do we start to shift our focus on that? Why do we need a bigger focus on that at this point in time?
I'm happy to start. I know I'm sure Drew has a lot to say about this as a leader in this field, but there are some big players in the embodied carbon. There are at least 5 really big players: concrete, steel, aluminum, insulation, especially petrochemical insulation, plastics. And as architects and interior designers, we specify these materials with abandon. We're not actually saying, gee, how little concrete do I need to put in to make this a structurally stable building? And there's some wonderful innovations in floor slabs, which is a big use of concrete in addition to foundations, where you use bubble deck as a way in which to do innovative, very structurally, in fact, structurally stronger than just pouring a lot of concrete with rebars. A bubble deck is a little teeny, millions of little vaults created, but with bubbles. So you can do things very innovatively to reduce the total quantities of concrete, steel, aluminum. Of course, wood construction is as an alternative, and the exploration of mass timber and cross-laminated timber is a really exciting, because it not only reduces the footprint of materials, it can actually be selected to sequester carbon, to actually take some of the carbon back out of the atmosphere. Insulation, we probably need to move away from petrochemical-based insulation and move to more benign natural insulation. Plastics, we just need to reduce altogether. And there is something very exciting about this, because it requires a lot of creativity, and it opens up a new palette for designers that actually are biophilic, and it tends to improve the quality of the indoor environment. So I think the focus on embodied carbon is going to be a really wonderful catalyst for the design community.
Yeah, designers, if you're watching this, you hold the power. Listen to us. You are very powerful in your decisions. Yeah, it's really true. Specifying materials, the interior designer or the architect has a huge amount of influence on the carbon footprint of the design of the project, from the embodied carbon that Avi was talking about. And Avi, I know you've written about this, and there's studies out there that show you've got the initial build of the project, but then every so often, every 7-10 years, you get a new interior fit out and a whole nother set of products are specified. And that's where you get that compounding effect over the life of the building. Over 50 years, you'll see a huge impact over each one of those fit outs completed. So yeah, be very aware of your selections. And I talk a lot about designers need a third screen. It always used to just be the aesthetic. You're looking at the aesthetic, the design aesthetic, how things look for the client. And the second thing was you're always looking at the cost, right? Making sure you're not selecting something too expensive and staying within the budget. There's got to be a third screen for sustainability, and that's been happening more and more over the last 20 years. But to really, complete a life cycle assessment, LCA, and understand your carbon footprint or your material selection. So that's the tool to use. If you haven't done one before, if you're a designer out there and you want to make an impact, you want to be a positive influence on the climate crisis, start to make a life cycle assessment a part of every project that you work on in your firm.
We're going to be sharing some resources later today as part of today's programming on, some of the tools, some of the perspectives you can use for responsible specification around materials, especially around the carbon footprint and the global warming potential of materials. So, more to come on that. There's plenty of amazing resources out there if you want to educate yourself. But I couldn't agree more. This industry has the power. I mean, Elizabeth at USGBC, you guys have been, had front row seats and been prime movers in the enormous amount of change we've already made, right? There are so many things in the way we design buildings that, as a result of the green building movement, we just don't do anymore. The wide adoption. And then there are factors that, have changed based on what we understand about health and well-being. I mean, somebody recently reminded me that people didn't put asbestos in buildings because they had fun doing it, because it was just the most appropriate material available at the time, and yet as our understanding of what that material does to human biology changed, now of course we would never dream of, we have asbestos abatement when we come to an old structure, right? We're going to find that many of the materials we use today are going to be the asbestos of tomorrow, right? And so, we have to be aware of that, and we've made huge progress, and there's so much more that we could be doing.
At Kielhauer, we carefully consider the carbon impact from design to end of life, working with third parties to assess and reduce our carbon output throughout the process. The result is the beautifully designed Swerve in a range of colors. The first Kielhauer product that is completely carbon neutral and has zero impact on global warming. We carefully selected material with low carbon features. We offset the inevitable carbon by investing in offset credits and climate change mitigation projects. We are design activists, and we believe that great design and sustainability can go hand in hand.
Elizabeth, I know that at USGBC as well, your LEED carbon rating, is starting to take stock of embodied carbon. Is there anything that you'd like to add there in terms of, material selection and sort of the carbon footprint of materials and products?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we do certainly have that LEED Zero program, and that we are seeing more and more projects come through that and earn different aspects of it, and that's so exciting. We also think of embodied carbon in sort of 3 categories. The first one being the design team, and that's where that creativity that you talked about is so exciting, because we have the potential for rethinking what we've decided we need. So when an owner or a group comes to a designer and says, I need an X, that's where we can say, okay, so how can we completely restructure this so that it has the lowest embodied carbon possible and lowest, of course, operating carbon costs as well. So the design team, as you guys have said, have so much power in order to transform how we're imagining what comes next. And then, of course, the construction team and the product manufacturers have a really big role to play with EPDs and renewable materials and easily accessible content that has recycled products and the circular way of building that incorporates reuse and all of that. So using salvage materials and all of that, I feel like we've gotten there some with LEED. We figured out how to quantify that, and we're trying to do it more simply all the time. But that rethinking is, I think, the most exciting frontier, where we can redesign and create a new imagining of what's possible.
I just want to chime in quickly, Avi, just to add on to what Elizabeth's talking about, related to human health, from the impact of materials on human health. And just like when you go to a grocery store, you can pick up a box of food off the aisle and look at the ingredients that are in the product that you're about to consume. We have not historically had that for building products. We don't know what, crazy toxic chemicals are in the products that we're putting into our buildings. And that's been a big movement the past few years. International Living Future Institute also has something called a Declare label that's disclosing and making it transparent what the ingredients are in these products that we're sitting on and breathing in the rooms that we sit in and our kids learn in all day. So it's another exciting movement, and it's kind of different from the carbon impacts that we're talking about, the carbon footprint. This is about disclosure of chemical ingredients and materials related to human health.
And the tools that do both address carbon and address human health sometimes have common ground. Elizabeth, you mentioned an EPD. An EPD is an environmental product declaration. And again, we're going to go into EPDs a little bit further, in a subsequent segment of this program. But EPDs are a designer's best friend today, right? Not every product has a Declare label. A Declare label, of course, just discloses every chemical, every sort of component that's in a product. But an EPD comes pretty close, in terms of telling you at least about the potential environmental impacts that a product might have. An EPD, for instance, estimates through a life cycle assessment the carbon emissions that a product is bringing with it, sort of the embodied carbon emissions that a product is bringing with it into a project, right? And so it's a very vital tool. It's a really vital tool, and I think the more we can educate ourselves about some of those basic tools and how we can use them to inform our work, the better off we are. Of course, it's possible to go deeper and deeper and deeper into this. There's many layers to the onion, and as we peel back one layer, we find we need to learn more and know more. EPDs and Declare labels are a great example. They tell you, what chemicals are in a product, but they don't necessarily tell you how they got there and what impact they've had on communities in the process of getting there. For instance, there's other tools for that. There's a Just label. You should look into that as well. But that is important because as architects and interior designers, we're not just responsible for the material as it goes into a building. That material also has had a whole life before it ever got to your job site, right? And in that process, not only has it emitted carbon, which we've been talking about as embodied carbon, but also it's affected people through its life, right? And so there's a huge materials transparency movement in the industry. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, being transparent about, where, and the declarations are part of this movement, where our materials and products come from, and what impacts they've had on the environment before they ever got to our job site, and then the impacts that they're going to have on people who use and occupy the buildings that we design. So I wonder if anybody wants to just characterize sort of the materials transparency movement and why it's so important to all your work.
Maybe the best example of that is the wood industry when they started to certify forests. I mean, the whole idea of chain of custody. Do you know where the extraction occurred and whether they were actually living wages and acceptable environmental conditions for workers? And how far did it travel and what other processing did it go through and what were the chemicals involved with that processing? And I think, and then ultimately, where does it go when it's no longer in use? You talked earlier about Drew did, the number of cycles of change in interior environments, especially in office buildings and retail stores. I mean, there's just a constant evolution of space. And unfortunately with that, there's a lot of waste. And we often just sort of put our hands up and say, well, it's not my problem because it's out of my hands, but it's actually in our hands to select products, number one, that are so valuable that people don't want to throw them away, which changes the economic discourse if you're saying, I want to buy something that's timeless and that people want to keep, and or designed for disassembly. And I think and these are, again, really exciting shifts for the design community that really I think are very exciting for us as professionals, gives us a whole new avenue of innovation.
Right.
Yeah, I would chime in. What's catalyzing change here? A big thing is just the phrase "vote with your dollar," right? That's so important to remember. You vote every time you spend $1, you're voting for something. It's really important to remember that. And so it plays into designers specifying products. Like those are the products that are going to get purchased and installed into a project. And again, designers hold the power and the key. You guys are selecting products and you're voting for these products. And the more votes that they get, the higher the demand will get, the more will get produced, the more they'll be incorporated into buildings, into the market. So just remember that in your specifications. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to market movers like Google. It's a great example. Google's headquarters project in the Bay Area, in the RFP, they decided that they were going to pursue Living Building Challenge certification. And they were going to go after products that had declare labels. And so all the furniture companies that were bidding on the project immediately went and started getting declare labels for their products. And so it's when a big company puts that in RFP, it really makes other companies in the marketplace react. It has a very positive impact directly in our day-to-day work. And I think we'll see a lot more of that happening beyond this Earth Day in the near future.
I'd love to chime in on that too. I think with LEED, we often talk about telling the story of LEED, and I really appreciate how the discussion has talked about how each of the parts of building have a story, and the making of the project has a story. My husband and I were designing and building a house. We were able to access materials that had been salvaged and wood that was from sustainable forests. We were in Montana at the time, and a lot of the forests there need to be thinned in order to reduce the fire risk. So we were able to work with this amazing man who helped us to use that wood, mill it locally, and then bring it to the site. And at one point I was reading a Dr. Seuss book to my kids, and I'm forgetting the title of it, but there was a movie made of it. Maybe someone else will remember it, but they were sort of saying like, wait, Mom, our house is full of wood. Where did all this wood come from? It was about the Lorax, there we go. And so to be able to say to your kids, we did our best to like bring our integrity to this house and to this story. I think that kind of story is of course a tiny micro story, but when we apply that and we apply like the research that Professor Lofness brings to things and the large scale of Drew's work, we have that potential to be able to give our kids an empowering story.
Right, absolutely. Drew's been cautioning us not to get too caught up in the jargon. It really is about, understanding where things come from, how they're made, right? And we need to know that because, for a long time, we created processes and products without thinking about, those after effects on the environment and on people, without considering them fully, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes not, right? And now is the time that we kind of have to go back and almost do this investigation, do this, mode of inquiry where we have to look into everything that we're designing, make sure that what we're voting for with our dollar, again, to steal Drew's phrase, is something worth voting for. How do we put our integrity as design professionals behind, what we do? I have one more thought connected to this that I'd love to bring to all of you. The one other thing that the pandemic has taught us is that, very often these, giant crises, these global crises, and the climate crisis is going to be a slow burning crisis, right? The coronavirus epidemic was a quick burning, crisis. These crises tend to affect people most who have the least resources, right? Who already bear the brunt of inequity, already bear the brunt of like lack of opportunity, you know, and they're likely to be the first people affected. I mean, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the UN, you know, set this out quite clearly. They said, you know, unless we do something by 2030, we're going to see by 2040 real impact on communities around the world. So I guess my question is, you know, how do we cast a wider net with what we do, right? How do we have, what can we do that has an impact on not just the people who pay for our buildings or the people who get paid to work in them or live in them or the people who have bought them, but rather has a wider impact in the world? You know, is it possible for us to do that as architects and interior designers?
I think these are totally interrelated. I mean, there's no question that the wastefulness and the energy, carbon, and material intensity of the past has contributed to the inequities. So for us to be far more conscious of, you know, the materials we're using, and will contribute to a greater sense of equity. And just very specifically, if you look at infrastructure investments that are potentially going to be emerging in the United States in the next 5 years with some serious speed, and we start to say, where should those infrastructure investments be? I mean, I'm part of a Smart Surface Coalition that's focused on the horizontal surfaces, the roofs, the streets, the sidewalks, the parking lots, and we pave everything, and we pave it with dark stuff. So we create heat islands, and we create spaces with no greenery whatsoever. I mean, we strip all the space of greenery and we just pave it and it becomes inert. We have essentially sealed the skin of the earth. And if we're going to reverse that with infrastructure investment, we need to reverse it in a very deliberative way to deliver a higher level of equity. We need to do tree canopies and you know, and rain gardens and a continuous green space, green roofs. You know, if you think about a driveway, instead of doubling or tripling the size of your driveway so you can have more cars, what if the driveway went back to being 2 strips of concrete in a meadow, where it's just the exact width of concrete you need to drive into your garage, and everything else is given back to the earth and to the bees and to biodiversity? I think we're at a threshold now of being able to sort of rethink the investments in our infrastructure in a way that not only helps the earth, but addresses and start in the communities that have the least.
Absolutely. Before Drew and Elizabeth weigh in, I just wanted to say we covered this very interesting project in Metropolis that came out of Columbia University, where they overlaid maps with you know, the highest infection and death rates from COVID-19 with the places that have the highest ratio of paved to green space. And no surprise, neighborhoods that have the most paved space are also the neighborhoods with the highest incidence of COVID-19. And that's not because of any direct connection between those two things. Paving does not cause COVID-19, obviously.
Yeah.
But what it says is that the same social indicators underlie both of those things, right? So it's a really fantastic story, you know, and I would urge you to just run a search for it on the Metropolis site. You should be able to find it. You know, it's incredible how inequity is kind of coded into our built environment in those ways. Sorry, Elizabeth and Drew, I'd love to have you both come in as well.
Yeah, no, great point, Avi. We hit a scary milestone recently too. Many of you might already be aware, but we went above 420 parts per million in atmospheric CO2 in the past month, you know, prior to this Earth Day, which is the highest it has ever been recorded. And I think at pre-industrial levels was maybe, you know, 300, I believe, parts per million. Now we're up to 420 just in the past couple hundred years of burning fossil fuels around the planet, pumping them into the atmosphere. It's global. It's the same terminology again. It's global warming is the same terminology for what we're talking about with climate change and the climate crisis. The sun's rays are coming in, getting trapped, and heating the planet. And yeah, it's a scary milestone that we've hit at 420 now. I think policy is a huge part of the solution, Avi. again, I go back to what I experienced here in California with the drought, a few years ago, and a policy immediately having a 30% reduction. If we can pass through a carbon tax and attack the social cost of carbon by making companies pay for their carbon emissions, that will have a very immediate impact. And companies are starting to pay attention. Right now, it's all voluntary, right? The leading edge companies are starting to pay attention and voluntarily do some things to reduce their carbon footprints. But if we have a tax that forces everyone to do it, it'll make a huge impact immediately. So big changes ahead. I think companies should start to plan for a reality in the near future where a carbon tax is a real thing. We've been talking to our clients about that now. I mean, they're doing calculations that project, millions of dollars of costs around their carbon footprints that they would have to pay for, so that to the extent that they can reduce their operational carbon, embodied carbon footprint now over the next 10 years as we move towards 2030, it's a big cost savings for them. So something for companies to focus on today on Earth Day.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when we start to look at the sort of city climate planner level, the scale of change that takes all of the pieces into account at more of an urban level, and we start to incorporate those costs, the long-term costs to businesses, to communities, and both quantify them in terms of looking at what the variables are that affect people who are in more vulnerable positions, and then also ensure that we're paying attention to the qualitative aspects, that we're noticing who isn't at the table and trying to find a way to make space so that more people can be at the decision-making table, so that the experience is truly informed by the whole. And the federal policy reflects that, state policy, local policy, so that the stories that we come out of this next challenge with can reflect all of that expertise, all of that background, and the needs that we might not even think to be aware of. I think the pandemic showed us if we have any extra, that it makes the pandemic so much easier. If we're able to, at the beginning of the pandemic, buy toilet paper, or if there's a significant event in a family's life and they're able to order food that night so that they don't have to prepare it. I think that those little tiny changes that we might have been more aware of during the pandemic, if our neighbors didn't have access to those things and we did, or if our neighbors had access to more than we did, I think that those small experiences taught us to reframe how we imagine what's possible for ourselves and for others. And I hope that we'll bring those forward into what comes next.
Avi, I'd like to just jump in there because it sparked, Elizabeth's comments sparked an immediate response about bringing everyone to the table. Environmental hazards that are associated with manufacturing and power production and transportation and a number of other things, we have a tendency to not, and this of course, it becomes a global challenge, not just a local challenge. We tend to not feel them because we essentially have chosen to live away from the environmental hazards, right? So a lot of the decision makers who are deciding the future of buildings and built environments and infrastructures tend to be oblivious. And the important thing is to make sure that the table is, and who's at the table is completely aware of what the environmental conditions are on the ground, and then committed to fixing them. And I think one of the very early goals under the LEAD program, which I think is critical, which is the 500-mile radius for hiring not just professionals, but buying materials and assemblies. And what it did is it said, we're going to hold responsibility for how things are sourced and manufactured and delivered, and we're going to provide employment. And keeping things within a 500-mile radius means that it's in your backyard. And I think that's going to be an important lesson for us to deal with both equity and regeneration of the planet.
Right. I think, both your comments, as well as I think Drew's comments about corporate leadership, really point to how we need a very healthy, participatory movement, a really kind of grassroots movement in order to really make change happen. And I think as architects and interior designers, again, we have the power in terms of who we choose to consult on projects, right? Whose voices we choose to hear, what kind of groups we choose to bring into the room for our charrettes and our research phases and our design development phases. That is a sustainability decision too, right? It's not just about how much carbon or what you specify, but also who you bring in the room and who you're listening to. And Drew, of course, the leadership that we've seen, with some of these big, giants this past year, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Salesforce, you name it. So many of these large corporations have made big carbon neutrality commitments, carbon negativity commitments. And because they're seeing, the events on the horizon, they're seeing that at some point we're all going to have to pay for, what we've spent and what we've put out there, and everybody has to pay in their little bit, right? When Google has to pay millions of dollars in carbon tax, that is going to kind of affect their employees. It's going to affect their larger sphere. It's going to affect all their suppliers and all their partners. It's going to affect, everything has an effect on all of us. We are all connected. And so that's important that, when we bring in, multiple and diverse perspectives, and when we look at things both locally and globally, that's really important. So Vivian, that 500-mile radius, that is so key to some of the initial thinking around LEED, is still so powerful in terms of how it can shape our action and our thinking. I would love to kind of, just hear some last comments from all of you. We've spoken a lot about what architects and designers can do in the professional sphere, how they can influence the world for the good, how they can help fight the climate crisis. Is there anything to add in terms of what architects and designers can do professionally? And also, or do you have suggestions for what they should be doing as citizens and consumers, on this Earth Day? What are some Earth Day resolutions we should all be taking?
You hold the power, guys. Everybody's decisions matter. It's really important to remember that. Don't let yourself think that you're not part of the solution or that it's too big of a problem for you to have an impact on. Every individual matters. And most of us in the design community work in teams at work, and you influence the people that you work with. You influence all the other firms that are part of your project. So be an advocate for these issues, for climate-related issues on your teams at work. You guys hold the power. And then in your personal lives, Avi, I think that's a great point. Like these things don't happen immediately, but next time you get a car, make sure you get an electric vehicle. It might be 5 years from now, but do that. Look at solar panels on your home. There's small things, use green cleaning products right at home. There's little things that you can do as well, but make these choices and vote with your dollars. I think that'd be, and stop burning fossil fuels. Focus on that and focus on the carbon impacts of your choices to get off fossil fuels.
I'm happy to speak to another action. I think definitely vote also, but putting our elected leaders and telling them what we want, not just when we vote, but also in an ongoing way of building our own expertise, building the expertise of our communities, and helping to bring those things forward and say that this is the world we want, this is the world we require. At the USGBC, we're really happy to have those social equity pilot credits that emphasize the supply chain, the project team, and the community, and continue to push us as the USGBC and engage with us as a place where we want this expertise to continue to grow. And also just don't stop imagining the world that we all hope will be there next. Let ourselves have as much freedom as possible in creating that, imagining it, and building it one small step at a time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I might end with 2 points. One is where I began, which is I think we have to get all those pie diagrams replaced that really do tell the story of not just buildings, but the materials in buildings and the land use patterns that are associated with the built environment. and how much impact they're going to have on the greenhouse gas footprint and how much opportunity we have to really reduce that wedge of the pie. But the second message I wanted to add was just and Drew's right, there's a lot of words out there that, to describe sustainability and all the range of sustainability, but one of the probably the most powerful is regeneration. And I think the notion of regenerative environments is a way to remind us first to achieve LEED and living, building, and well. I mean, take every standard you can and make it your standard, and then take a step further. And the step further is the regenerative environment, in which we're actually giving back more than we take. And it has to do with sequestering carbon. It has to do with rewilding the world, taking up less land. I mean, to my mind, we are in a transformative moment for the practice, for the professions that are part of the Metropolis family. And I think we have a lot of wonderful opportunity.
Thank you all so much for joining us for this session. It's been absolutely wonderful to have Drew, Vivian, and Elizabeth on today's panel. A huge thanks also to Kielhauer, who sponsored this event, and who are partnering with us for a lot of our Earth Day content this year. Thank you all so much, and have a great Earth Day.